Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to another session or book club meeting of Hizmet Reads. This month we read the book A World Between Us, Ethics in Interfaith Dialogue by Dr. Johnston McMaster, who's here with us today. Welcome, Johnston. Thank you for being here with us and accepting our invitation. We were just speaking before we came live about how I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book and how hopefully we can feed in some of the questions that we were sent. And of course, if anyone has any questions during the live discussion, we can also channel them in. But Johnston, just before I pose to you my first question, I'd like to kind of quickly introduce you and the work you've done to perhaps those who are unfamiliar. So Dr. Johnston McMaster was the coordinator of the Education for Reconciliation, 1997 to 2012, with the Irish School of Ecumenics, the adjunct assistant professor at the Irish School of Ecumenics, Trinity College, Dublin, as well as being a member of the Council of State for the President of Ireland at current. So welcome once again, and thank you for being here with us. The first question I'd like to start with is, where did the journey begin to writing the book? What were your kind of main ideas, inspiration? Where did the theme come? For those who have read the book and know that at the beginning, you do have some contact with members of the Hizmet movement. But where did the idea of the book come from?
Thank you for the welcome and the introduction. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to an interesting conversation between us all for the evening. Thank you for asking me to be part of that. I think this book began in friendship. I was with, as you say, the Irish School of Ecumenics, Belfast-based, and responsible for that Education for Reconciliation programme. And I got a telephone call one day from members of the Hizmet movement in Northern Ireland who wanted to meet me and talk about the possibilities of dialogue. Now, I had already designed some courses in terms of interreligious dialogue and interfaith dialogue. And here was another level beginning to develop as we met and decided, yes, we should try and see where we can collaborate, cooperate, introduce dialogue, and we did. And so breakfasts began and conferences were held. And then there was an invitation to accompany one of the Hizmet movement leaders in Belfast or in Northern Ireland to a conference in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. And I'd been invited there to give a paper on wisdom, hikmah, hokmah, and sophia, to use the Arabic, Hebrew, and Greek words. That was a fascinating experience, a good conference. And the next time we had breakfast together back in Northern Ireland and dialogue, a suggestion came, well, look, you had this paper, why don't you write a book and develop perhaps other themes around dialogue between Abrahamic traditions and faiths? And so it began there. We explored what content might be, explored how to approach it, and out of the friendships, and by this time I think the friendships were well established, and there was a lot of trust and respect for one another, and dialogue and sharing and understanding, and so so a book emerged, and or the idea of a book emerged, and that was when I had to discipline myself and begin to work my way through themes and ideas. But from the beginning, it was a book that was going to be rooted in the Abrahamic traditions and bringing those traditions into a conversation with each other. And I did that, as you've discovered in the book, by bringing together the thought and philosophy and theology of Fethullah Gulen and the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and then some other voices from the Christian tradition, as well as my my own theological perspectives and experiences within Christianity. So it's a book about dialogue, and it's a book about ethics in dialogue. But it began through developing friendships, and some people coming up with good ideas, but leaving me to do a bit of work. But that was fun. That was fun.
Yeah, it's exactly what I was going to ask. I mean, you do touch upon the Abrahamic traditions very early on, and that's something that you continue throughout the book. But the book also has a chapter or two, perhaps we could say 3 sections, which more focus on the Hizmet schools that you visited in a few different countries, and kind of religious and social cultural contexts, which are different from one another. Where did the idea of incorporating Judaism, Christianity, and Islam as analysis, and in some aspects, I think a synthesis, really, they come together, and you can see how they're in parallel or in the same meaning. And I remember, I think it was a sentence where you were talking, I think on the Hikmah, Hukmah, and Sophia concept again, where you said, you were talking about a Jewish tradition, and then you were saying that Gulen would, of course, call this an Islamic tradition. And it draws the parallels between the 3 faiths. Why did you think that was necessary to have? Is it a dialogue between the faiths, which is something that you're looking at overall from start to end? And also, why did you pick the scholars that you did, and you explore Islam through this theology of Fethullah Gulen? And for him, he would say, what I'm talking about is Islam itself. But there is pluralism and plural understandings. And early on, you talk about there being fundamentalists and literalists, and the importance of a hermeneutic study of all faiths. Why did you pick the individuals that you did, and why the 3 faiths?
Well, I think as the breakfasts and the conferences and the dialogues were developing within Northern Ireland, there was the introduction through that to the thought of Fethullah Gulen, and I recognized this was a significant and important voice of Islam, and I think my library grew significantly, and I've ended up with quite a selection of books around Hizmet movement and around Fethullah Gulen's thought. I must say, I don't think I paid for any of them. They kept coming as gifts, so I've built this library. But this was the introduction in some depth to a particular thought and expression of Islam. I had always been conscious that the Abrahamic traditions had a great deal, I think, in common. They have common roots, Abraham and all the rest of it. And so I was conscious also that I could not understand, and I didn't understand my own Christian tradition without understanding the very Jewish roots that are there. And so I thought, here's an opportunity now to really look in some depths at Islam, Judaism, and Christianity in a conversation and dialogue with each other. Now, I think you're quite right. The voices that are heard in the book do not exhaust any of those 3 traditions. And there would be diverse voices one recognizes as well. I think there is a pluralism in a way within all of our traditions, but you can't cover all of that in a book or one book. But here was an opportunity, I felt, and a challenge to see if 3 voices basically here could come into some kind of dialogue. And my commitment was also a commitment to social ethics. I have worked quite a bit in that in other ways, in other dimensions. So I had this concern about social ethics, and by this conversation between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and these voices, could we find some kind of social ethic that perhaps could be shared and was held in common and would make a difference to life together locally as well as globally. I mean, I think we know that the three Abrahamic religions that embraces, I suppose, most not all, but most of the religious people, if you like, on the planet. Christianity and Islam are two very large traditions in terms of adherence and numbers, if you like. Judaism much smaller, but the roots of Judaism were there for both of us in many ways. So here is an opportunity and a challenge I was glad to pick up and try to bring these three traditions into conversation with each other and see if they could produce a shared social ethic that would make a difference to life, not just at the personal level, but more importantly at the public and social levels. And I think our faiths, our traditions, they are not individualistic faith traditions. I think they are essentially social public traditions with something to say to life in, sometimes we describe in the West at least, a secular world. But those traditions have something to say, I think, within that world, and have something to say, I think, also together. That and Fethullah Gulen is, I think, strong on this in a way that bridges the kind of religious and secular world. It's a non-dualistic approach, which I think we need to develop as an approach a great deal more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was going to mention, but I just realized that I have forgot to do so at the beginning of our discussion, was how in the book you start from a point of the world has shrunk. Now we're in an era of globalization. Yeah. We get to know one another more. And then in kind of parallel to this, you also bring out how things like imperialism, for example, has both harmed society. And there is, of course, a very long historical legacy of that. And now we're in a world where the world has shrunk. Our neighbors are either next door or they're virtually as we are now. And then the world's much smaller. And we're experiencing getting to know one another in a very different way than perhaps 100 years ago. Very, very different, I assume, to 100 years ago. But bringing this into kind of my next question, which was on the term of tolerance. In the study, you look at how Gulen's advocate and the work that he's done is often described as the term tolerance. And of course, you later on in the few paragraphs later say that perhaps that isn't the best word, and that what the term that Gulen uses is the term of hoşgörü. Do you think this is the best way to kind of describe his efforts? I mean, I think a lot of his work, which has been translated into English, I even remember, a title of one of his books does have the term tolerance in, but how we understand the term tolerance in the West is very different to what Gulen's talking about. So I was kind of wondering if you could describe that and just unpack it.
I wasn't, I think what I was, the critique in a way that I was raising was not a difficulty with the word that Gulen is using in his own first language, if you like. It was the weak sense that the English word has acquired, and I think it's that for me is where tolerance is heard in a way, I think, in English that means I'll put up with you if you put up with me. We'll kind of tolerate each other, and it's a weak word. Whereas I think the word that Gulen was using is, as I understand it, is to see the good in the other. Tolerance is seeing the good in the other, and it is also a kind of empathetic understanding or empathetic encounter. So there is empathy involved in tolerance. There is seeing the good in the other. And since the book, I've made a very late discovery from within my own Irish culture, and it is the meaning of the Irish word for tolerance, which I didn't realize at the time when I wrote this book. But the Irish word for tolerance translates as see how well she listens or he listens. So tolerance is also listening well to the other, seeing the good in the other. And I think those are much more positive meanings than the word has acquired generally within English usage. So I think in that sense, tolerance is a word that we need to, well, let's put it this way. I think we need, sometimes we can talk about, we remint coins. You know, we melt them down and they come out in a different form again. We need to remint some words or recover the strength and positivity of meaning in some words. And I think tolerance, listening well to the other, is something that I think we struggle to do in my own Irish context to each other. And in this global world that you quite rightly mentioned, and that I drew attention to right from the beginning of the book, where we are now not just global citizens in many ways, but our religions have been also become global religions in the sense that they are not a religion here, a religion there, but they are religions in coexistence and living alongside each other in East and West and North and South. So there is therefore the challenge, I think. How do we relate to each other? How do we see each other? How do we not put up with each other in that weak sense of the word? How do we look for the good in each other? How do we come to some kind of empathetic understanding, getting inside each other's identities and shoes and thought forms and imaginations, which are culturally different very often, or shaped by different experiences of culture. So I think there is something very positive in that word, which is important as we develop a kind of global citizenship and realize our interdependence and interrelationship with one another on a global scale and not just locally.
I mean, the kind of Irish root or understanding of the term tolerance as how well we listen is half of dialogue, I guess. The one listening ear and then the person opposite talking.
It took me far too long to realize that. And part of the reason for that was that I've grown up, I did grow up, and I, not all of my life in Ireland, but most of it has still been lived within what for the last 100 years has been Northern Ireland. And because of the contested history and contested cultures, learning the Irish language was not something that happened within my educational system in Northern Ireland. And then you begin to realize that I've missed a great deal by not knowing Irish and not being able to understand, speak Irish. Mm-hmm. So we sometimes talk about being slow to learn. Well, slow to learn because I think sometimes the political system in this case was manipulating education in such a way that if you were part of a state school in Northern Ireland, you simply did not learn the Irish language. So you missed the richness of words like that and other words that are in Irish language and the Gaelic language tend to be very, very poetic.
Mm-hmm. That's, I mean, something that on a personal level, I've kind of lost in my own period of growing up, I guess, as well. Because, I mean, I'm half Irish and half Kurdish ethnically. And I unfortunately have none of either language, again, due to political reasons in kind of both contexts. So I've lost a lot of cultural depth, linguistic depth, and understanding myself. So it's something I can relate to. The next question that I had for you, I mean, we kind of spoke about intercivilizational dialogue, I believe. It's something that you mentioned in your book as well, but your book was published in 2015, so I'm assuming you visited the Hizmet schools around the world in the year or two before?
Yeah.
Of course, we've now gone through a period of a global pandemic, and the movement itself has changed a lot significantly, both internally and across the world, in how its schools or those motivated by the theology or inspired by the movement itself. And in line with the pandemic and kind of global shifts and changes as well, do you think that there's kind of been a change in how we should define inter-civilizational dialogue, or how it should be carried out in recent changes?
I think I would want maybe to look again at what I was trying to say when I used that expression in 2015, or I probably did the writing in 2014. But because in the last point you were making, you raised an issue of in globalization. I think you were touching on things like imperialism and colonization and so on. It's very interesting because in the last year I've published a book on living with imperial legacies, and I'm currently teaching that course. And have taught it already in another location. Living with imperial legacies, empires, racism, slavery, and colonialism. And I think that has meant part of that experience of thinking about that, writing about that, of teaching or introducing that to groups of community education groups, and the kind of dialogue that's going on around those themes begins to raise a question as to who defines civilization and who has defined civilization. And I think the empires very often have as the ultimate and absolute truth about something. And therefore, those who were colonized were often colonized on the basis that they were not civilized or part of civilization. And so I think we are really still living with legacies of imperial legacies. I mean, as a European, I'm conscious, and in this course and book, we've become very conscious of the fact that for 500 years, 7-8 European empires dominated the planet. And the legacies of all that in terms of slavery and racism and ethno-nationalism eventually and colonialism have been huge, and we still live with the legacies of that. So I think we still need the dialogue, whether it's inter-civilization or a dialogue about civilization and what we think we mean by civilization, and how we can unpack and critique and critically unpack what has been claimed by a succession of empires as being civilized or civilization. Because that, I think I've come to realize, that's an imperially loaded term. And I think we need to be critical of that and look at it, but we need dialogue to explore that.
Yeah, and also, I mean, in the book, wherever you talk about colonialism or imperialism and the legacy, the words "and capitalism" tend to follow, which is something that I enjoyed reading in your work, because you touch upon Jewish theology and Christian theology and the life of Jesus as a Jew, and how these things were kind of intertwined with their lived experiences. And I guess arguably we could also say it for the Muslim community, but I think our discourse as a Muslim community really has been dominated by the effects of or impact of things like 9/11 and terrorism. So whenever we're discussing Islam or perhaps even reading our own texts, it's a lens that we're trying to look for, trying to educate ourselves on, and also our wider community, and protect perhaps vulnerable youth or other groups within our community from the threat of extremism. So I think we've perhaps, I don't want to say lost, but not put as much value on these areas as perhaps Christianity or Judaism does, and I think Islam does too, but we're not seeing it. So on this kind of theme and thread of the political, I really enjoyed your section in the book where you say that Gülen does not believe that the Quran is apolitical. And then you also talk about his kind of experiences in Turkey in the 60s, 70s, and really until he leaves for the US. But you say that just because Gülen doesn't see the Quran as being apolitical, it doesn't mean that he's using Islam as an instrument in political discourse. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could make that distinguishment, because it's something that's quite contextual. I mean, it was in Turkey when Gülen was arrested for a period as well. And it's also something that's quite contested in spheres of which his work is described and discussed, and in some spaces challenged. So what does it mean to see your Quran as apolitical and also not use it as an instrument of politics?
I think this is a big issue with which all our traditions struggle. I mean, as I understand Gülen, he's also very strong against the politicization of what he calls the politicization, I think, of Islam, or the politicization of the Quran. Now, I think what's the difference? Whether it's Judaism with the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible, or the Quran, or the Christian Testament in the Christian tradition, a lot of history has, not a lot of history, but too often in history, I think there has been the politicization of each of those traditions, in the sense that they have become, and I think it's when they become bound up with political power and the tensions of political power, and one might say the corruptions of political power, then I think our faith traditions become skewed, and they lose their essential focus, and their ethical, prophetic cutting edge. Now, that does not mean that, quite rightly, I think he's saying, that does not mean that the politicization is the, I think, when our faith traditions become, as I say, bound up with political power and become captive to political power. But that does not mean that the Tanakh or the Quran or the Christian Testament are somehow politically neutral, or not interested in politics. It seems to me that sacred writings, people of the book, sacred writings are essentially, one of their key major themes, it seems to me, running through all three, is justice. Now, since when was justice politically neutral or apolitical? Justice has to do with politics and the way political power is organized. Justice has to do with the way economic systems are shaped and created. Justice has to do with poverty and with violence and with war and with the things that so often dehumanize and threaten to destroy our humanity, as well as the planet itself. So that's only one word. Compassion is another key word that comes up in all of our traditions, our three traditions. And compassion is not privatized. That too becomes applicable to the politics and the economics and the cultural issues and the whole of life, the environmental issues. So the damage is when we collude with political power as domination. But we also do damage if we retreat into some kind of inner piety that ignores the public, the very public impact of the core values that I think lie at the heart of our three traditions.
I was just, as you were saying justice, I was just thinking in my mind, if I ever have to describe the Quran, there are two words that I use. The first is compassion, and the second is justice, but you said compassion as well. So that was nice.
And I think I think also when you read the Torah and Tanakh, when you read the Christian Testament, those are two of the key words that come out of all of our sacred writings. Okay, we don't always express the justice and compassion adequately enough, but I can't see how we can take the Torah seriously, take the Quran seriously, or take the Christian Testament seriously, and not be committed in life praxis to justice and compassion in the public square.
So to take this justice in the public square on to my next question, which is about peace building. So if we are to have a just society, and if this is something that our religions or faith traditions perhaps compel us to do, within this framework, you study Gulen and of course Hizmet. And for Gulen, peace building, Hizmet, dialogue, education, and the other elements of action that build up his theology are religious tasks. How do you say these fit in with his vision of an ideal world? You kind of touched upon it as well, but for Gulen, what is the ideal world, and what actions should individuals do, and by which motivations?
I've just spotted a sentence with which I began the chapter on wisdom, and it's a quotation from Gulen, and if I may maybe begin with that the road to social justice is paved with adequate universal education. I think that is huge. That is the embodiment of Hikmah, I suspect, as well as Chokmah and Sophia. So an ideal world and peace building. It's also why I think in 2 chapters in the book I tried to deal with nonviolence, because it seemed to me also that he has a lot to say about that as a way to peace, as part of peace building. It's also something which I think we can find at the heart again of Torah and Christian Testament. And so there are values. I think this is about values that go to the heart of what makes a flourishing society, what makes a peaceful society. And it seems to me that those values are justice, and I think our 3 traditions are consistent about this. There is no peace without justice. Compassion. Right relationships that are based upon justice, rooted in justice. And I think active nonviolence comes in there as well. And there is mercy, there is forgiveness, there is tolerance in the sense that we've been talking about it. And all of those are core values, I think, that need to be at the heart of peace building and peacemaking, and the construction, if you like, of a flourishing society and a common good. So I think we share these. And we need, I suppose, to identify them in the dialogue together, commit ourselves to the practice of these things, offer a public witness, because I think that's what prophetic traditions do, and Judaism, Christianity, and Islam would claim to be, and are, I think, prophetic traditions. They speak critical words, but they also offer visions of alternative futures and alternative worlds, and this is how we do it. This is where these are the values we bring to the processes of peace building and reconciliation between peoples and in our world, locally and globally. And of those, in a sense, I suppose what we're saying here is that these values that I've tried to mention, and I think I discover, and they're unpacked a bit in this book, these values are essential to, let's say, statecraft, the building of society, just societies, compassionate societies. And without those values, I think we will struggle to build not so much the ideal world as an alternative world. Because I think the role of faith and the role of religion and the role of our faith and religious traditions is a public role without, or rather resisting, the temptations and the pitfalls that might try to pull us into a collusion with power as domination and power as oppressive and power as exploitation. To go back again to the imperial thing, I think our faith traditions, it seems to me that our three faith traditions are very strong, lively, resistance movements, if I can put it that way, to any form of imperialism or domination system. That includes when the religious systems themselves become imperialistic and dominating.
That was where my thought went to, but you mentioned that again.
Okay.
So it's a good thing. I just wanted to go back to the very beginning of your answer to this question, where you quoted Gülen, I think, mentioning global education as being key.
Yeah.
Here. Gülen's model of education, I mean, for those who are perhaps joining later in, Dr. McMaster had the chance to visit several different Gülen-inspired schools across the world, including in Urfa in Turkey, in Pakistan, in Thailand. I think they're the ones mentioned in the book, but you've also visited ones in Africa as well. My next question is how would you describe Gülen's model of education? And this model at times has been, and perhaps still is being, also questioned and contested of whether it's a method of indoctrination, if there is some sort of evil intention behind, having so many schools across the world. You mentioned that the legacy of colonialism and schools being used can also have an impact on that. But I think within the Turkish state and understanding that this is an issue as well, because at the end of the day, it is a private school and sector that businessmen from Turkey and other places of the world have also supported. How would you describe Gülen's model, and what would you say about there being elements of indoctrination within this model?
I think that the charge of indoctrination is something that, again, all our traditions find leveled at them from time to time in different ways. And I've no doubt that sometimes our religious traditions do engage in indoctrination. I would not describe it, though, as what I experienced in the Hizmet movement schools. And it seemed to me that the model of education there was a rigorous education in the sciences, and an equally rigorous and robust education in values. Now, the values, this is where maybe the indoctrination charge can be leveled. The values can be perceived as, were these schools simply teaching Islamic values, which nearly almost implies that there are values that are exclusive to Islam and aren't anywhere else, which would be a huge claim. And I'm not sure I don't think he makes that at all. But it is that here are universal values, and here are truly human values. And in fact, here are the secular values. And it is that value system, the kind of values that I was mentioning in the peace building kind of response, are values that are at the heart of our Abrahamic traditions. They're also values that are at the heart of the human traditions and philosophies of life. And I don't think it's indoctrination. I didn't encounter any of that. And one of the richest experiences in those visits, I think, was in Thailand, where I was in two schools, but one in particular had 5 different religious traditions. Now we're talking about 3, and the book was about 3. But here were 5 young people from 5 religious traditions being educated together. I had a fascinating 2 hours conversation with they educated me. Some may say they indoctrinated me, but no, I don't think so. But I find that those kids, those young people, had a remarkable understanding of each other's traditions. They actually could articulate the essence and heart of each other's traditions. And there was the utmost respect. And there was no sense that any religious tradition was triumphalist or imperialistic in its approach. But here was an education and an educational methodology that essentially, at the heart of it, I think it was critical. It was critical thinking, critical knowledge, critical appraisal, critical exploration, critical testing of values, beliefs, and their application and connection with human and increasingly now environmental life, we would want to say. So I don't know. The rigor, I think, that was in the educational method in relation to the sciences and in relation to the values was not trying to, I didn't experience it anywhere as trying to impose a single religious tradition or some kind of imperialistic religious tradition on anybody. The encouragement to critical thought was I think impressive, and that perhaps impressed me most.
So just kind of to talk about those 3 cities that you mentioned that you visited, Urfa, Lahore, and Bangkok. In Turkey, Urfa is in the east of Turkey, and at the school there were both Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab students together. Mm-hmm. In Lahore, there were 530 teachers in the schools that I visited, only 170 of them being from Turkey, and the students amongst them, there were also Christian students, which is, as you mentioned in the book, unusual for Pakistan. And in Bangkok, as you mentioned, there were 5 different faith traditions being present in one school setting. You just mentioned critical thinking, but is there another key value or theme that you saw in these schools? Is there something that you could say was perhaps inspired by the movement? Is there a pattern, or is there something that you saw or experienced and you said this is a characteristic of the movement per se? I mean, it of course can be present in other traditions and movements, but anything that stood out?
Well, I think one of the big values, and we've already talked about it and unpacked it quite a bit, is there was education, if you like, in tolerance, and it was about young people learning to respect difference and respect each other in their diversity and difference. And I would have thought respect the humanity in each other, as well as respect what one might describe as the sacredness in each other as human persons and beings. So I think there was that. I think there was in Lahore, for example. I found it quite mind-blowing in some ways when I listened to a group of students talk so eloquently about human rights and so passionately about human rights. And there is, in a sense, justice in action, respecting people's rights and basic rights and so on. So I think tolerance, justice. Those were values that were also at the heart of the educational methodology, seemed to me. And I think if we're educating children in that critical thinking for themselves way, exploring, questioning, curiosity, and in a rigorous kind of way, we are helping to shape and prepare young people to be citizens in a world, and to be citizens who are peace builders, and to be citizens who are contributing in practical, concrete ways to the flourishing and common good of their societies and the planet. So I think those are impressions that I had, and they're very real ones, and they're ones that I came away from the experience of being in those countries and some of the others, feeling, yep, that's definitely not indoctrination, but I think it is education and values, which was not about moralism either. I mean, here was an educational approach that was encouraging young people to explore values in an open, critical way, and education. And if one takes the word from its Latin derivations, it is the leading out from narrow, confined spaces to broader, open vistas. And I think that's the kind of education that we need in this country, where I am, and need anywhere.
Thank you very much. I just want to remind anyone who's watching at the moment, if anyone does have any questions, that they can feel free to type, and hopefully I will channel them into our discussions. We are in our last 9 minutes at the moment. So if anyone does have any questions, they can, of course, feel comfortable just typing them in, and hopefully I'll voice them. One of my final questions was really, throughout the book in several places, and you do this with quite a few concepts, which I enjoyed because I think it reminds the reader how complex it is to define any of these things that we've been speaking about. You define Hizmet in different ways in different places of the book, depending on what you're talking about. So whether it's describing it as a movement, its history, its context, as a theological understanding, as a model of education, as a practice of dialogue, or peace building. There are kind of several different ways you can take the concept of Hizmet and define it. If I was to ask you now to define it, how would you define it? Was the final question that I had, but I will also double check to see if we have any questions from our viewers as well. So okay. I can leave you with that question.
I think defining something or definition is a difficult task, because the word, at least in English, we're back to languages again and back to cultures, but the word, as I understand it in English, the word define means to confine. And one of the tasks I'm involved in at the moment in Northern Ireland and the counties along the border is a big program which we framed as a question mark. Is there a common good? Question mark. And as we're in the year 2 and phase 2 of that program, it's very much a community-based program. And one of the things that we're beginning to realize, how right we were to put a question mark and ask a question, is there a common good? Because trying to define a common good it doesn't work that way. It's complex. It's got different angles and various angles. And this may be a long way around to responding to your question, but I think to define the Gulen movement, I'm not sure I do want to define it, because I think that would put limits on it. I think it has its own complexities, as all I'm going to say, authentic movements have. And there are different angles, there are different perspectives. But I think, again, for me, one of the things that, I suppose I'll risk this, one of the things that was very much at the heart of all that I tried to explore, and the dialogue or the trialogue conversation I was trying to develop in the book between three traditions, was again the heart of what I think is spirituality, which are essentially about values. What are the values by which we live? And I think the Hizmet movement and Gulen's approach is essentially about these values, which are very social values. That's not all. Again, let me not define it as that solely, because that would, again, is confining it. But those are key core values. And it seems to me that in a global situation, and it's not just the Abrahamic traditions now, we haven't talked about the dialogue that needs to happen between all the other world religions and traditions and faiths. But I think the heart of what his movement is about, the Hizmet movement is about, the heart of what Gulen is about, the heart, I think, of the Torah, the heart of the Christian Testament, is what are the values that make and keep and cause human life and environmental life to flourish. And if we take a lot of those values out, and we're always working, I think, on those values, not again as fixed, because they are values, not theoretical values. They are values for praxis. They are values for life. They are values for living. They are values for our social existence. So we are always working at justice and compassion and non-violence and tolerance and common good, if you like. So I think what that means also is there's no end to all of this. There's no fixed point or no static point. I think it's significant that the word used here is movement. Movement doesn't stand still. Movement is dynamic. There is a Jewish tradition in relation to the Torah, for example, which says there are 70 shades of Torah. In Judaism, that means ad infinitum. The text isn't fixed in its meaning. There is always more meaning that we will discover and which will challenge us tomorrow in different contexts and different times. So I think what we have in our three traditions as represented by Gulen in Islam and the kind of thing that the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was articulating as Judaism, and what I've tried to articulate with others as Christian perspective. We are movements who do not stand still, cannot stand still, and are ever growing and expanding in the best sense of the word.
Well, thank you very much. I think whilst writing the question down, I was hoping that it wouldn't be a fixed answer, and your answer has widened what I had thought of being the answer as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I know I enjoyed reading the book, and when I spoke to the members of the book club who'd also read the book, they'd enjoyed it as well. So thank you very much for being here with us. It was both an honor and a pleasure, especially the fact that the book was also published with our centre. And hopefully we can look forward to more partnerships and meeting, perhaps you in London or I in Belfast, to discuss and engage in further dialogue.
Okay. Like all good movements, we're open to all of that.
and with the flight restrictions being removed soon. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.